Hi. Thank you for coming to this session. The session is titled Neurodiversity 101, Understanding and Supporting Neurodivergence in the Industry. My name's Tara Allen. I almost said my full Berkeley title. I'm not here with Berkeley. I'm here as myself today. Um, hi, I'm Tara Allen. I use she, her pronouns. I'm just a visual description of myself. I am a white woman, cisgendered woman. I have medium length brown hair with bangs across my head, and I do have some green in my hair. I have a bunch of very colorful tattoos, which kind of give a traditional vibe. I tend to wear a very goth aesthetic. Um, I'm currently not. I'm currently wearing a rainbow dress, which is kind of the opposite of my normal appearance. In my picture, I'm pictured with my bass clarinet to my side and I'm smiling at the camera. Um, Qualifications, I have a bachelor's of music education from the Crane School of Music, and an MA in psychology and music from the University of Sheffield. My personal relationship with neurodiversity, I myself identify as multi-neurodivergent, and I also identify as disabled. My real other relationships is that I am a cisgendered queer white woman, and all of my biological family is also a variety of neurodivergencies. So we're a group of neurodiverse people. Um, some of my professional experience with neurodiversity, disability, and the music industry generally. Before I started working at Berklee College of Music as the neurodiversity program manager of the MIND program, I was a music teacher for 4 years in New York State Public Schools and 3 years in the UK. I do a lot of advocacy and a lot of talks, similar to today. And I myself am a music psychologist. My specific research area is music and neurodivergence. So, in a lot of cases, I'm interested in understanding accessible formats. I'm interested in making music and the music space accessible. I'm also very interested in the perceptual and cognitive aspects of musicking for neurodivergent folks, such as perception and behavior. Our goals today are to create a foundational understanding of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and two is to further participants' understanding of the unique struggles of neurodivergent clarinetists and how we can support them. Section by section. Section one, we'll be talking a little bit deeper about what is neurodiversity or neurodivergence. Section two, we'll be talking about the unique challenges of neurodivergent clarinet players and how to support them. And there will be a section three, which is an opportunity for questions. In this space, I encourage you to leave and enter as you wish or need. Please feel free to move, sit, or stand as helpful. Um, Respecting the space, if you'd like to have your camera off, feel free, and just make sure that we're all muted at all times unless we're asking a question. Just we have folks with a variety of sensory needs. Um, Access to information, I have prepared image descriptions. Everything is high contrast. I am using a sans serif font, large font, and this presentation is as plain text as possible. In this learning environment, it's important to know that this is a space for learning. There are no bad questions, and all forms of participation are valid, whether you're communicating in the chat or raising your hand to speak, or communicate whatever's best for you. And that we just have a lot to learn from each other. It's a really important point. Section one, neurodiversity. I just have an image below that is of the neurodiversity rainbow infinity symbol, and it's kind of just like a repeated pattern. So I keep throwing around these fancy terms. What do they mean? So I think it's important to first start with neurotype. A neurotype is the specific way that one person's brain works. It is often reflected in how someone communicates, expresses themselves, learns, and processes information. Within that scope of neurotypes, we have what's called neurodiversity, which is the overall variety of neurotypes. And there are also two larger neurotypes. There are groups within neurodiversity. We have neurodivergent, which are neurotypes that the world are not built for, and neurotypical, who are neurotypes that the world is built for, i.e., accessible. Another term that's really important to know that a lot of folks confuse is the term neurodiverse. Neurodiverse refers to a group of people varying in neurotypes. A single person cannot be neurodiverse. I always point this out because I'll see a lot of folks saying, for instance, I had a colleague the other day that was talking about me and wanting me to give a training to their department. They were like, "Oh, Tara's neurodiverse. She can come give a training." And I had to say, "Hey, like actually, I'm not neurodiverse. I'm neurodivergent." Um, Neurodiverse would be, for example, someone you have a group of four people or even two people, myself, and then someone who's neurotypical. We as a group is neurodiverse, but I as a person cannot be neurodiverse. I would be neurodivergent because of my neurotype. Now, I keep saying neurodivergent, and I've specified here that it's a neurotype that the world isn't built for, but what does that mean? Who does that apply to? Well, it's actually a much bigger list than folks recognize or know. In a lot of cases, when I say neurodivergent, the immediate thought is autistics and ADHDers, but it's important to know that this is actually a much bigger spectrum of people. So for instance, some of the lists that I have here is dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, epilepsy, functional neurological disorder, OCD, psychogenic non-epileptic seizures, both types of PTSD, both types of bipolar, traumatic brain injury, any and all phobias, depression, all types of anxiety, schizophrenia, borderline personality, Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, all types of migraines, including migraines with aura, synesthesia, dissociative identity, depersonalization and derealization, alexithymia, and honestly, probably way more than what I know and what is on this list. Um, some folks like to think of it as, if you have a diagnosis, you're neurodivergent. I would say yes. It is more so a change that is different to a change in some cases. And it's always in relation to the way that that person thinks and the way that they perceive the world, and also in relation to their social and cultural standards of how they're treated in society compared to the main folks, the neurotypical folks who the world is built for and it is accessible for. There's two other important subcategories of neurodivergence to know about. There is what is called born with neurodivergence. So these are neurotypes such as autism, dyslexia, ADHD, Down syndrome, synesthesia, epilepsy, yada, yada, yada. This is essentially neurodivergence that one is born with. That is, they are born with this brain wiring in comparison to what we would refer to as acquired neurodivergence. It is a neurotype such as DID, BPD, depression, PTSD, etc. And it's something that they were not born with, but it's something that maybe they were initially neurotypical and they had accrued because of an event that occurred in their life, whether it's social, emotional, or cultural, that has changed their brain chemistry. And because of that, they are now neurodivergent because their brain has changed and has changed their perception of the world and the way that they interact with it. I always like to bring this up because there's this misconception that mental health-based neurodivergence is not neurodivergence, and it's really important to note that it is neurodivergence and is a neurotype under the neurodivergent identity as well. Now, how do we view neurodiversity and neurodivergence generally? When we talk about the variety of neurotypes, a lot of times you'll hear people use the one dimension spectrum, which is more neurodivergent or less neurodivergent. I will say a lot of self-advocates have said big X, no thank you. And there's a variety of reasons. No one is more or less autistic, ADHD, bipolar, whatever. And they're also high and low functioning has actually been seen as quite offensive to the neurodivergent community as well. There's a lot of variety of reasons. For one, it creates stigma. For instance, let's use the example of, I'm trying to think of what it's called. There's a TV show, oh, Love on the Spectrum. Using that example where they're showing these people that are more autistic than other people, but there's no more or less. And it's this stereotype about autistic people. And because of that, folks like myself who watch this go, I don't see myself reflected in that person. But then someone else will come around and say, yeah, but it's because you're less autistic than them. But what does that mean? Especially when we think about the social and cultural impacts, especially as someone who is what we would call a high masking autistic person. For folks who don't know, masking refers to hiding traits of neurodivergence. This can be one's facial expressions, their hand gestures, their tone of voice, etc., which can often be associated with someone's neurodivergence. And this is where some of these terms have started to come in. In a lot of cases, these terms will be used to minimize those people's lived experiences that people believe are less neurodivergent. And it creates a lot of harm for the community and also those people who are experiencing that. It also implies that everyone is the same, and it also implies that, in this case, hilariously given its name, that neurodivergence isn't actually a spectrum, right? Because if we have a spectrum going this way, there's not really a lot of room to actually discuss what that means. It's unspecific. Just like any person, any neurotypical person, neurodivergent people have skills, strengths, and also weaknesses. As I said before, it also is this language and this system is used to minimize and discriminate against neurodivergent people. And it also leaves a little, very next to little room to actually discuss the strengths that neurodivergent people have. The two-dimensional spectrum is my favorite. I love the two-dimensional spectrum because it actually shows where on the spectrum that person is in that skill. And it also helps us be really specific and actually identify the skills of neurodivergent people. As I said, very skills oriented. It is super specific about their needs because you're able to actually show on the circle where their skill is, and then you can then be specific, say they're really good at XYZ thing. Um, we also love this because it follows the neurodiversity paradigm, which we'll talk a little bit about. This also helps reduce stigma because there's a lot of stigma around neurodivergent people having less ability and yada yada. And this is, actually, no, they have a lot of skills, but we've not been recognizing it because of the current system. It also helps us create a better understanding of ourselves and each other. And also, it's not so limiting in this way that it's viewing it from a deficit model. So this is an example. So if we were to compare, this isn't really my spectrum circle, but let's say I'm the neurodivergent example and I'm with my neurotypical peer. Looking at the circles, you can see the outline is dark. There's two little dark outline circles, and then we have, I'm not going to say normal functionings, that's not the correct word. This is just commonly where neurodivergent people, neurotypical people, are with these types of skills. And obviously, like any person, our skills can go in and out of these circles and these spaces, but this is the common space where they are for a neurotypical person who doesn't have access needs. Now, if we move over to the neurodivergent example, um, as a clarinet player, I can actually say it's kind of accurate for myself. Motor skills, fine motor skills. Example, moving my fingers all in unison might be really difficult for me because it's all the way out here and I'm really struggling with it. Perception. Oh my goodness, there's so much of the staff notation. I don't know what's going on right now. I'm really struggling. My sensory seems to be okay, and my executive function is okay for now. Like I'm really good with planning and that kind of thing. And maybe my language is, I don't want to say above average, but I have better language skills. It's important to know that neurodivergent skills tend to be a lot more sparse like this and compared to a neurotypical person. And that's just due to the variety of ways that the brain are wired. Now, I talked a little bit about the neurodiversity paradigm, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into that as this is also a social and cultural impact. It was created in response to the pathology paradigm, which views neurodivergence as a deficit or a disorder. Viewing neurodivergence from this way, similar to the single spectrum line, puts neurodivergent people into boxes of right or wrong, a normal, abnormal, ordered or disordered, which leads to believing that there's something wrong with us rather than what is wrong with the accessibility of the space and what the person actually needs at that time to be able to be successful and participate. Love the neurodiversity paradigm. So in contrast to that, the neurodiversity rights movement in the early 2000s came up with what was known as the neurodiversity paradigm, which was specifically coined by Nick Walker. It views neurodivergence as a biological reality, a natural part of humanity's brain diversity and very humanity. It's just as they say, because Nick Walker uses they them pronouns. These dynamics include the dynamics of social power relations, the dynamics of social inequality, privilege, and oppression, as well as the dynamics by diversity, which embrace acts as a source of creative potential within a group. And it's important to know that just as similar to other parts of the human diversity, such as race, culture, gender, and sexual orientation, the neurodiversity paradigm takes on all of that on top of viewing neurodivergence from similar lenses of diversity. This is really important, especially when we're working with our colleagues, our students, and other folks, because it helps us, one, understand the culture and the identity of that person, but also it's helping us create the best creative potential and success for that person and really our team and just everybody. Um, it's spectacular. Some important identity language to know. Some people in the neurodivergent community do prefer person-first language. This does put the person before the disability. Example, student or person with a disability. Person-first identity language can be used by many members of the community, even the disabled community. Example, my colleague Jamie identifies as a person with a disability. At least in the United States, this language is used with the Americans with Disabilities Act and was the preferred language for quite a bit of time, but due to changes in socio-cultural and emotional and neurodivergent and disabled folks wanting to reclaim their identities in a lot of way, the birth of Identity First Language came. So identity first language puts the disability first, i.e., it is a part of me that is unremovable. Some examples are disabled, autistic, ADHD, capital D, lowercase d, deaf, blind, and dyslexic. Another really important term to know is disabled, which is an identity first term. It's important to know that a lot of neurodivergent people don't identify as disabled. I just happen to be one of those unique perspectives that I do identify as both. And there's a variety of social, cultural, and emotional reasons. In the US, the first thing I think about is like cure culture and other things. So some neurodivergent people said, no, it's a part of who I am, and I shouldn't have to change that, and I don't identify as disabled. I think if you're ever in doubt and wondering about someone's identity language, I would just say, hey, how do you identify? Um, and really, if it's up to them and their comfort, they might explain to you why they identify in that specific way. But if you're ever in doubt, I would just ask. So, what are some of the unique challenges of neurodivergent clarinet players, and how do we support them? This is a common theme that I've seen throughout my own life, but also among my other neurodivergent colleagues. So it's so important to talk about. The first thing that I think about, and a little bit of list of unique challenges. The biggest one is definitely traditional musical notation, can be quite difficult. Dexterity and fine motor skills, sensory processing, communication differences, and other expectations of not just the clarinet industry, but also the music industry. So we're all clarinet players. The first thing I think of is the Hindemith. We're all pretty familiar with Sonata 1. And looking at this sheet, we just go, ah, yes, the Hindemith, spectacular. But when a neurodivergent person looks at this, moving on to our next slide, now that it's color coded, oh my goodness, that's a lot of information. In this context, I've color coded it by the specific thing that we're looking at. So for instance, at the top, I'm looking at the specific tempos of the piece. I have put in dark blue the meter. All of dynamics and crescendos are put in pink. In red is all this additional information that might be cues for other instruments. Dynamic markings are in green. And all accidentals are in blue. This can be really stressful for a lot of neurodivergent folks to look at for a variety of reasons. The first thing I think about is that it's very noisy. The second thing that I think about is that there's just a lot of information to process, and especially if you experience dexterity, sensory processing, etc., this is going to be really hard, especially to sight read. And I think that this is something that we don't think about a lot just because we're all musicians and this is the traditional musical notation is how it's always been. One big thing with this that I think about that is not color coded is rhythm perception. Rhythm, just like meter or the actual staff and the clefs, are symbols. And folks with neurodivergencies such as dyscalculia can really struggle with rhythm perception, and this is more so the perception of rhythm in space and time on top of the other symbols of the actual staff. It is important to know that folks with learning disabilities can struggle with this a lot. How can we help? There's a variety of ways, but the thing that I have found the easiest, so I'll give an example. So recently I worked with a student with dyscalculia, and she came to me and she was like, Tara, I literally cannot perceive this rhythm. This is really difficult. My professor is asking me to conduct, which I have fine motor skills, and it's really hard for me to conduct. But then also, I'm having to count the rhythm in time. But also, what is time? I don't understand where these notes are actually sitting in space and time. This doesn't make any sense to me. When working one-to-one with the student, I asked the student, I said, hey, like, how do you learn? And we were talking about, the student disclosed to me that the best learning system for them is visual and that visual and kinesthetic, and they need time to step away from the actual notation because it's confusing. And also because of their specific fine motor skills that they actually could not count. So they're being required to have movement in the mouth, and their tongue and their, speaking, but also having to actually visually perceive the rhythms that are occurring, but then also having to move your hand and conduct and count in time. It was just too much sensory processing, but also having to read all of these symbols that were difficult. Like, where are they? What does that mean? I'll use the example, I'll show you the example that I use with the student. But some things that you can do to help folks with this, I say chunking and breaking down as little as humanly possible. With the student specifically, I was breaking it down into 2 beats, not 2 bars, 2 beats. And I would have the student do it repeating over and over again, and then we go, oh, great, you got it. And then we would move on to the next 2 beats, and then, oh, great, you got it. And then we go, okay, we're gonna look at the whole bar now. And we took it really slow, and then we kept speeding up. And it was very useful and helpful for the student because it helped the student, especially at that slower tempo, actually feel where it is in space and time in relation to their conducting, but also they were able to point at it kinesthetically first, which gave them more opportunity to actually feel. And in this context, I created these little visual boards that were visual of the rhythm, and her and I would pick them out together and put them in order. Um, and then I would be the metronome and I would count out loud. I'd go 1, 2, 3, and not as quickly, obviously. It was much slower, it's very largo. But she would sit there and she would taw the bee and actually point at it. And it was very helpful for her because she was struggling with the perception of the pitch, but then also especially the rhythm on top of it. And it's important to know that folks with dyscalculia are not the only students that struggle with this. A lot of dyslexics who also struggle with fine motor skills and perception of specific symbols and notation, ADHDers, autistics, the list goes on forever. But that is just one example. So the closest example that I found, I'm sure you guys have seen hundreds of these online. I cannot recommend them enough. They are spectacular. This is the exact thing that I did with my student, except I was the metronome, and we did not have the musical notation on the side at all. I kind of gave the student the shapes and I said, hey, like, let's work together to figure out where these go with in relation to these. And then eventually we would actually draw them on there and add additional color coding. So this is an example that could be really helpful for folks who struggle with rhythm perception. So for a lot of neurodivergent folks, having this visual aspect can be helpful because they can actually physically feel, they can hear the metronome, they can hear the big beat, but then they can actually, without having to worry about one E and a two E and a, especially with a student with dyscalculia or dyslexia, depending, or both, that student or that person who is struggling with that rhythm perception, they're able to remove the actual notation that is causing the additional stress, and they're able to actually just visualize it and completely break it down. And I recommend this to literally anyone who struggles with rhythm perception, because sometimes in this struggle, even just saying it out loud can be really difficult. Sometimes the first step is actually the visual aspect because then they can feel where it is in space and time. And for a lot of neurodivergent folks, that is where that gap is. So, a little bit further into additional like formats and things. I won't be able to show all of you these today, but I'm happy to talk through any of these with literally anybody. There are alternate formats of traditional notation. Examples, tablature, like I think it's a little bit harder as a clarinet player. But there's the claver, I can't pronounce it. The second one, there is Dodeca, Clairnote, numbered notation, and Parsons code, which is pretty cool set of notation. There's the chromatic staffs, which is different as well. There's figure notes, and then also modified staff notation. So when I say modified staff notation, I guess what do I mean by that? I mean, for instance, removing crescendos and other things that might not be necessary that are just adding noise. I mean, adding more space, actually like enlarging the staff so that there's more space in between the notes. So for instance, there's a lot of neurodivergent folks that if the staff notation is too dark and too close to each other, it can become really blurry and it can be really hard to differentiate the notes on the staff. I mean, the example of that was kind of in the Hindemith that we saw, was that tiny staff notation underneath on top of the staff. And that can be really confusing for a lot of neurodivergent folks who are just trying to process the staff by itself. So maybe removing that in some cases, like for some folks, is it entirely necessary that it's there? Is there a way that we can modify that? So I talked a little bit about this earlier, and this is something that is more one of those behind the scenes of the staff notation, right? Because not only are you having to perceive when you're performing with others all of the auditory information, when do I come in, keeping track in space and time, and then other audio, visual, perceptual, of the things that are occurring in, while you're performing. But the behind the scenes is the dexterity and fine motor skills as well. Many neurodivergent folks struggle with dexterity between notes that are close together. So, for instance, some right hand or left hand movements that are not engaging both at the same time can be really tough. Those are technically fine motor skills and can be really difficult. But also large jumps, for instance, if we're going from an E to a G. For some folks, their fingers might not all fall at the same time and can cause a bit of a blip sound. Synchronized movements can equally be as hard for some neurodivergent people, and that's just due to the difference of dexterity and fine motor skills in the brain. Um, how do we curve this, but also how do we help? Slow focus practice, and I know we preach this all the time, but I mean genuinely like very slow, like I'm gonna play this at a 20, maybe not that slow, but I'm gonna play this at a 20 and I I'm just gonna practice this one little bit for like four, maybe not 4 hours, don't practice that long, but a very short 5-minute period of time. But also for neurodivergent folks, providing music ahead of time so that they can actually practice those fine motor movements is very helpful. Providing music ahead of time, just aside from the dexterity stuff, is also helpful for folks who have sensory and processing difficulties, such as staff notation, rhythm perception, yada yada, some of the other stuff that we talked about earlier. But also understanding as like a culture within the clarinet industry and the music industry, understanding that blips can also just be could happen in the performance. Someone can practice it 100 times, but sometimes the brain is just having a difficult time processing that information, and that a blip will happen and nothing is ever perfect, and that's okay. And I think it's also being okay with that is important and something that should be respected. Um, it is really important to note that within this, one I really like to talk about was embouchure and tonguing. So yes, with our fingering, it can be really tricky, but within the movement of our lips and our mouths and like our face and our tongue, especially folks who have taken speech language, and folks with like communication-based disabilities, etc. This can affect the tongue. It can affect the speed that they tongue at or the way that their tongue moves and articulates. I think that's really important to note. This is something a lot of folks don't know. So for instance, I have functional neurological disorder myself, which is a seizure disorder, but it also causes me to experience loss of motion in my face, in my arms, and sometimes my legs. This does cause difficulty because I experience paralysis in my face. This can cause difficulty with holding my embouchure correctly, my tongue articulating, but also because of my other neurodivergencies, it can cause, due to processing so much information at the same time on the staff, my tongue will start slowing down because it cannot keep up with all the processing and then also having to create these fine motor skills. So I talked a little bit about sensory processing, and there's quite a few different kinds across neurodivergence. There's the visual, the auditory, and I've added emotional processing here for a variety of reasons. For one, as we've discussed on the last few slides, musical notation, traditional notation can be extremely noisy. For some folks, the actual sheet music itself can actually either be way too bright due to the high contrast, or it could be too dark, dependent on the person. How do we curve that? I think it's always important to know and ask a neurodivergent performer if they have an additional need. For instance, maybe they might need to do it on an iPad where they can change the color, or offering to print it on a different color that is preferred for them. Could be very helpful. For instance, for me, musical notation tends to be way too bright, and it actually causes the staff to blur. It can cause me quite a bit of sensory stress, which then actually fully affects my performance. Um, I tend to prefer grayscale, but it's important to know that every neurodivergent person is different and they have a different preference dependent on their sensory needs. As I said, difficulty processing music at fast tempos is no different than reading a book with words. That does translate into music, and it can affect, for instance, if you're having to read at 160 tempo, you're trying to process all of the notation, but also process all of that kinesthetic. It can be very difficult for that person. Sight reading can also be very difficult. In a lot of cases, we tend to give accommodations that give folks in auditions, at least at Berkeley, this is how we do it. We give folks additional 3 to 5 minutes, dependent on their disability, to sight read. And in this context, it is not so much an extra thing, it is more so it is giving them time to actually process what they are reading so that they can then connect the fine motor skills and then go, ah, there's the key signature. Ah, here's the millions of things that I have to process right now because I'm really struggling. Another really important one is noisy concert halls can be a really big one. You know, people are coming in, they're loud, people are playing their instruments really loud. Um, Allowing that person to have something such as loops. So for folks who don't know, there are these little fancy earplugs called loops. I love mine. And you can actually get ones that are specific for concerts, but it actually helps dim the sound. And when someone starts talking, it actually directly focuses on that person who's talking, or if we're performing, the loudest instrument that is performing as well. It's really helpful. But it's important to know that noisy concert halls can cause a lot of sensory distress for neurodivergent people, which then could affect their performance. Differences in emotional processing. There's a variety of neurodivergencies, such as autistic folks, ADHDers, people with PTSD, bipolar, yada yada. The biggest one that I think of is alexithymia. So if people are not aware of alexithymia, it is someone who has a very difficult time processing emotion, and then actually connecting and putting a word to that emotion. For some folks with alexithymia, it can take days for them to process that. Um, and I'm sure you're saying, Tara, what does this have to do with anything, with what we're talking about? A really big thing we talk about as clarinetists is, wow, you gotta express the emotion of the music, and wow, what were you trying to portray? What was the initial intention? And for a lot of neurodivergent folks, they're gonna say, well, I don't know. I don't know what the composer was thinking. It's definitely with a lot of those of some autistic folks of, well, I'm not literally in their head, so I don't know. But For folks with like alexithymia who are listening to music, they might not understand, they might not have fully processed how that music is making them feel, or how it should, I don't want to say should because that's not the right word, but it's the differences in emotional processing causes us to understand and perceive music differently, which can actually cause more dramatic differences in performing a same piece. It's important, since as a music psychologist, we do all perceive music, emotion and music differently anyway, even across neurotypical neurotypes. But when we add the mix of neurodivergent people, this becomes even more vast. When you tell them to play with more emotion, they're going to say, "What do you mean? I don't know what that means." Being specific is so important, but also maybe give an example of how you felt about the music or how you were perceiving it, but also giving them time to listen to a recording in advance and process it and say, "Hey, I've listened to these four recordings. This is what I've perceived." I think is really important because that is a part of that sensory processing as well. Some other things, we talked a little bit about the alternate formats, a little bit about different colorations. Um, Audition accommodations are spectacular. I gave the example earlier of allowing a neurodivergent person an additional 3 minutes to look at the sight reading, um, or allowing them to start when they're ready. Um, this is really important because they're already experiencing a high level of stress, especially if they do have a comorbidity of neurodivergencies. Um, but offering them audition accommodations is so important. There's a lot of misconception that in the music industry and in clarinetting, that well, it's music, you don't entirely need an accommodation. Well, given the notation and given all the variety of factors we've talked about, accommodations are completely necessary and also are legally owed in a lot of cases to neurodivergent and disabled folks. But it's more so how do we frame it in a way that we can create access for them, which is the important thing. Um, One of those audition accommodations could be receiving music much further in advance. This gives them that additional processing time of everything. As I said, extra time for sight reading. And also being cognizant, as I said, of the different emotional processing and expression. When I say that, that does also refer to performance styles. You will see a lot of neurodivergent people might stim or move when they play. I know I stim and I move when I play. And I know in a lot of cases, early parts of my career, this was kind of seen as like, oh, you need to be sitting still. But actually, it's helping me, moving around is actually helping me process the information, and actually cope with all of the sensory information that's occurring around me and my colleagues. Um, and just understanding that that will look different for every single person, and that after the rehearsal or whatever, they might not be able to talk. They might need to go home or go somewhere quiet or that kind of thing. Really big one. Stage lights and clothing requirements for performing. Light coloration could either be too bright, too dark, in most cases too bright, and it could also be the specific coloration. Some folks with epilepsy or seizure disorders can be really sensitive to color, which then could cause them to have a seizure. But also autistics and other neurodivergent folks have it's the way that the brain processes light and color. It can cause extreme difficulties that cause sensory overwhelm that then affects their performance, and that is just due to the lights. It can make it really difficult for them to concentrate. It can make it hard for them to perceive everything because they're shutting down. And I think that that's a really important point to make. If we're talking about the specifics of what we wear to concerts, having very specific clothing and fabric requirements can be really and not on purpose, but unpurposefully ableist against neurodivergent people. There's a few reasons. Sleeves and specific fabric texture requirements can be a lot for a neurodivergent person. So maybe just saying, hey, like our coloration today is gonna be black on black. Perfect. But if you're saying, oh, we're all gonna wear black satin, that's not gonna work for a lot of neurodivergent people. You must wear sleeves. It's important to know again, sensory differences are different for everybody, but creating really strict specific clothing requirements can cause additional sensory stress that then affects their performance. It is important to know that there's a variety of different kinds of communication differences among neurodivergent people. We're not going to talk about every single one of them today, but we're just going to talk about the ones that do definitely affect clarinetists and musicians um, in everyday life and performing. So some examples of neurodivergent communication styles are info dumping, echolalia, asynchronous communication preference, can be direct communicators, differences in body language. They could be non-speaking or experience situational mutism. And also, they might need plain text or use plain text. So what is asynchronous communication? It is when you send a message without expecting an immediate response. Some examples are receiving an email, responding to minutes, hours, days later, responding to a text a day later, getting back to someone, waiting until you've got home from work to call someone, or sending a response 2 minutes later. Synchronous communication can often be really demanding for a neurodivergent person, especially folks who struggle with planning and language processing. Um, that means that that person is not only just having to process what you've said, but also having to process what they need to write back to you, and also think about the social expectations of, is this socially appropriate by neurotypical standards for me to say this? Um, but it can cause a lot of difficulty. It causes significant anxiety because it does not allow enough time to process and plan a response. This can cause a lot of stress, especially in our industry where it's like, hey, like tomorrow, can you come to this performance and do XYZ for me and perform yada yada, right? Um, Sometimes synchronous communication is necessary in some of those cases, but this is when I talk about plain text in a little bit later, that if synchronous communication is a necessity, using plain text can actually be very helpful in these situations. It's important to know that a lot of neurodivergent people have differences in body language. This can mean that they may move more. In my case, I move my hands a lot. They may slouch. I'm currently slouching. They may lean in, or they may use really expressionate facial gestures, or maybe really non-expressionate facial gestures. But they also may speak monotone, or they might not speak monotone. They might speak very expressionately. Um, it's important to know that a lot of neurodivergent people don't make eye contact and sometimes even physical contact. Um, there's a few reasons, and the biggest reasons that eye contact and physical contact can actually feel quite intimate, especially eye contact. So it's a different processing, and especially when we're talking about neurodivergent people who do experience these differences of body language, they're portraying their body language type, and then they're then having to then try to perceive the neuronormative body language type words. You need to be making eye contact, you need to be engaging with the crowd, you need to make physical contact during this part of the movement, you need to be making facial expressions with the crowd so that they know that you're doing this and that. And this is where I say that like those body languages can cause a lot of difficulty, especially for clarinet players. If you're a solo clarinet player doing a solo performance, especially in that more one-to-one intimate moment, the expectation is that you're making eye contact with people in the crowd. The expectation is that you're maybe being humorous in between the songs or creating some type of like interest or talking about this. And especially when we add the layer of folks who have communication difficulties, who are non-speaking, etc., this creates a lot of additional barriers as well. So it's more so, where do we meet in the middle? How do we accept the differences in body language as a performance style, but also how do we change the culture in some regards as well to be accepting of these differences so that all clarinetists and people in the industry can be successful? I talked a little bit about this earlier. So plain text, what is it? It is a model that follows simple words, straightforward language. It usually has short sentences that has one idea per line. It is very beneficial to people with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, who identify as autistic, language processing, and even folks who English is their second language. This can actually be very beneficial for them. So, plain text tends to follow, aside from the short sentences and specific short words, it also follows the use of bullet points. It's very direct commonly, and the main idea is usually pushed towards more closer to the front of the sentence. So let's use the neurotypical written example. Hello, Kevin. I hope this email finds you well. I want to reach out to you regarding your accommodations request and documentation. We have processed your request, and we recommend that you set up a time with an access advisor here from our website. If you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out at any time. Looking at that text, I go, hope this email finds you well. What do you mean? The first thing I'm thinking about is what's the main point? Why are you reaching out to me? And then the second sentence, they're saying, you're reaching out to me. But about what? And then now I'm having to process all this extra information because there's a lot of unnecessary words. I don't think you have to tell me that you've processed my request. I just need to know what is the next step. Awesome. Thanks for reaching out to me about my accommodations. So if we look at the plain text version, hello, Kevin. I hope you are well. We have received your accommodation request and documentation, period. Next steps are listed below, and then actually bullet pointing the step. The last sentence has been completely minimized to be much smaller for the main points, concerns, questions, or access needs to attend, reach out. I always find that please do not hesitate to reach out to me anytime, kind of a nightmare, because then you're making me process all these additional words. Just say reach out anytime is really helpful. Also, you'll notice in comparison in the plain text version, actually creating space in between the points is really helpful for a lot of folks with ADHD and a variety of other neurodivergencies. As I said, the main point can get really lost in the sentence, especially if lots of run-on sentences and it's not clear and direct. But in this context, creating space goes, he's hoping I'm well. Okay, what's the next point? My brain now has time to actually process and group where the information is. And it makes it a lot easier for a neurodivergent person to point out, there it is. That's so helpful. That's exactly where it is. And especially if it's bullet pointed. But also for a lot of dyslexic learners as well, creating space in between main points can be really helpful, especially if the text is very close to each other. This is just due to the processing of the symbols, but also just where the space of where it is on the page helps dyslexic learners read easier. So generally, plain text is very beneficial, not only just for autistic people for specificity, but also people with other types of neurodivergencies. Um, I know that I'm using the example of an email here, but it can also be used in text, like when you're texting with a peer saying, oh my goodness, let's play a duo today, that kind of thing. This is a system that can also be used to help create less of a communication barrier and specificity. So what are some other expectations of the industry? Neuronormative expectations. What does neuronormative mean? It essentially means a group of neurotypical people who have come up with these expectations for an entire group or a society, etc. In our industry, clarinetting and just the music industry as a whole, it is that we must always be grinding and practicing. For a lot of neurodivergent people who experience burnout, it's essentially it's not helpful at all. We burn out a lot faster, and that's just due to the way that our brains are built. And it can cause a lot of additional stress, and then it leaves these folks out of opportunities and things that they can and really should be participating in. Um, for those of us who have acquired neurodivergence, having to work through poor mental health is not good either. If you're not in the right emotional and social state, you're not going to be able to produce your best work. And that's where that grinding and practicing time also ties into this. You're always expected to be on all the time, when actually we should be spending time resting or doing this other thing. Um, the other thing I think about is also social expectations. We're expected to go out and communicate with our orchestra, communicate with our section all the time, constant communicating, constant speaking. For a lot of neurodivergent people, that can be really exhausting, but also in like situations like we are on now, where we're all on Zoom, where having one's camera on and having to like regulate one's facial expressions can actually be really difficult. And especially when in an industry where collaborating with a bunch of people, speaking to people is completely necessary for our career. This is when I challenge and I think, what are other ways that we can be engaging with each other, not just online, but like in person? Is there a sensory room available? Is there built-in time into conferences that people can genuinely like take a break and like go outside and just be by themselves? Um, but also, like I said, for a lot of neurodivergent people, that socializing aspect can be very difficult. Having to speak and look and appear a certain way, and this is where those different views of professionalism can become a bit of a concern. Neurodivergent people, especially autistic folks, tend to have very different views of professionalism. For instance, I go to work in a rainbow dress at Berkeley. People would say, Tara, you probably shouldn't go to work in a rainbow dress. That's probably not professional. And then that's when I say, what does it mean to be professional? And this is when we talk about, but you should go to work in like a monotone colored dress, but then I go, but then you're minimizing my expression now, and it's like, where is that line of differences in professionalism, but also in social expectation and how we are socializing with each other and creating community? So, what are some things that we can do to support? As I said, providing rest time is absolutely crucial for neurodivergent folks, and this is time that should be built in. Especially providing music in advance can really help with this because then they can break down and specify the parts that they want to practice. But then they can also add breaks in because they've been given enough time. They may require much shorter, more concentrated practice sessions. They might not be able to practice 5 hours a day. It might be, I'm going to practice for 2 hours today, but it's going to be like spread out over 20 minutes throughout several times throughout the day. I don't know why it says Pomeroy. The Pomodoro method. For folks who don't know, which is kind of the method I was referring to, the Pomodoro method is essentially a method that breaks down a task. And this task, for instance, you could say for 8 minutes, I'm going to practice my Behrman book. And then for 10 minutes after that, I'm going to take a break. And then I'm going to go to my Krebs book. That is an example of the Pomodoro method, and that also helps with concentration, and it helps with that very specific thing that they can concentrate on, whether it's dexterity with that, whether it's processing the staff, etc. And that kind of does tie into having a clear practice routine. So if you're working with a neurodivergent student, not having too much things for them to do, but more so, hey, like this week I want you to do these two things. And within these two things, let's talk about your clear practice routine. You're gonna do 8 minutes of this little bit here, and then you're gonna take a break. For a lot of neurodivergent folks, it can be really difficult to engage what specifically it is that they need to be doing and what is being asked of them. But then also the actual planning and breaking down of the task can be extra difficult, which then causes frustration, which then causes them to not want to do it at all. And then, you didn't practice your instrument this week. What happened? This happens a lot to neurodivergent folks. But this is also where, working with a teacher or also yourself, if you're a neurodivergent music professional, is working with what is my frustration tolerance? What is my limit? And if I've learned anything in cases of practice sessions, even if I'm taking 8 minutes to learn this thing and I'm really frustrated with a passage, I'm going to move on and come back so that at the end, I can actually take that little passage and break it down exponentially smaller to reduce the frustration that I'm experiencing. And I'll keep slowly coming back to it and not in big chunks because then that'll cause deeper frustration. And as I said earlier, providing alternate social engagements. So for instance, like we are online, I'm here with my camera on, which is totally okay because I'm speaking, but having an opportunity for folks to engage in more passive ways can also be really beneficial. Do they always need to be at a conference to make connections with people? And I know especially with social media, it does make it quite a bit easier to connect with other people that does not require in person and what we call masking of traits. Awesome. Is there any questions? I've not been looking at the chat, so this can be quite distracting for myself as well.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of the ICA committee for coming and talking to us about this amazing, it's really interesting and it gets a lot of people thinking a lot of different ways. So I think we figured out you're officially the second lunch and learn for the committee. So
Love that for
I
me.
know we dove in real quick. I was like, yeah, we're ready to start. And then I realized I was like, oh, I didn't even, but you did an amazing job of introducing yourself. So I felt like I got to know.
Oh, it's okay.
Okay, there are a few things in the chat box, but yeah, we'll go ahead and take questions now from anybody who has them.
And feel free to either type it in the chat or just raise your hand to talk. No need to turn your camera on if necessary. Thank you, Roy. Thank you.
I love your rainbow dress, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It's one
I
of
was
my.
gonna say I dress very professionally like 4 days of the week, and then on Fridays I go in and I like have a lot of I have several dresses, from that Larkin Sanders makes those prints like
Yep.
super
They
bright
are very cute.
clarinet prints, and my students love them so much, and they call me Miss Frizzle on that day because usually I
It's
like
for.
yeah, because it's like Friday, so I'll wear my hair down and my hair is like super curly if it like rains in Chicago. So
I will say, compared to the rest of my office, my students are always like, I can expect Tara to be wearing something very eccentric and fun every time I see her. And I was like, expect nothing less. That is all you will expect.
well, I feel like they're all still appropriate. I mean, it's not like they're
It is
inappropriate length or you're showing skin or something.
100%. But
Yeah.
it's like the way that we view professionalism is very like, it's just because it's that very classical mindset for sure.
I've heard lots of complaints about that very thing from people at conferences who are like, I don't want to wear these, um, like a suit every day. Okay, we've got a couple good questions coming in. Do you want me to read Liz's question?
Sure.
So she's had some colleagues mention that they have hesitations about making accommodations because they see accommodations as not being realistic of the students' future jobs, i.e., you won't get extra time in the classroom. You'll need to be able to count and clap rhythms for your students. How do you suggest responding to those colleagues? I also have those same colleagues. I think we all
I
probably have
deal
the
with this
same
every
one.
day, Liz.
Yeah.
I've had this conversation hundreds of times within the year of working at Berkeley in the disability office. The first thing I think about is, especially as professors and myself as a staff, our students are in an educational setting. And I think it's important to remind other faculty that given the Americans with Disabilities Act and the 504 Rehabilitation Act, students are legally obligated and protected to have those accommodations in classes. Realistically, because of those same laws, when they're actually in the industry, they actually have that equal opportunity to accommodations. It might change because they're out of an education system and it might look a little bit different, but legally, regardless of whether you're a student or you are a worker, you have the legal right to those accommodations. And so folks who make this argument that say, but they won't get this in the workplace. They will though, because they are legally obliged to give it to them by law. And anyone who doesn't, they could technically file a report, and I wouldn't say it like that. I would say it in the sense of like, hey, like this is an educational setting. There are laws that do protect our students that have these accommodations, but also when they leave into the industry, they have these same rights to an accommodation. And I can understand your worry, but it's important to know that they do have these rights and they should also know about these rights as well. There's a really big misconception that in the music industry that like, oh, we can't give accommodations, but actually it's more so people just not giving the accommodation because they think that it doesn't exist. But if we're universally creating them and encouraging them, then they'll happen more frequently and we'll see it more often.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think where where my colleagues have the most trouble is that we have a ton of music education majors.
Hmm.
So like, oh yeah, you're gonna be standing in front of your band and need extra time to figure out that rhythm. That's gonna go over well. Like is kind of the thing that plays in it, like I can see playing through their mind.
Hmm. I mean, as someone with a music education degree and someone who was a music teacher, there's also ways that that person can self-accommodate, and these are things that you can talk through with the student as they're studying. So for instance, taking that summer time to actually plan in advance and making sure that the stuff is done in advance. Maybe having a mentor, especially if it's their first year, having them help break down tasks. But also when they're in college in a music education program, a mentor should already be teaching some of those things to them. It's because that is the opportunity for them to create those skills for themselves, because it is a learning environment and opportunity for the student. So I mean, like when I was in a music education teaching program, I actually did receive workplace accommodations during my placement, and it's just because it's required by law, is an obligation. So for instance, accommodation could be that their planning time is protected time, and that could be due to organization, that it cannot be moved or touched. Another example could be um, receiving additional support from a mentor, which I mean is really common in most states, especially when you're studying and then also into your first year, just because that's like a mentorship opportunity. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I,
that does make sense. Thanks.
you're
I was
welcome.
gonna say, I think that's really, really helpful too. And I've seen, I was a Chicago public school teacher for a while, and I was very active in the union, and I was on the grievance committee. And I know that, like, even for simple things, like administrators will, at certain schools, right, they'll bully you. Like, and some schools
Mhm.
don't have the support of the state or the city they're in. And so if you have that, like, it's a little bit more helpful. But I've seen people bullied for the silliest things. And like
Mhm.
there was a woman who needed a cane to walk, and it took her a long time to get places. And they put her in rooms that were so far apart that there was no way she could do it. And like the and
Mhm.
so even things like that, it's like, no, you will get accommodations for that. Like you can, and it's very easy for people to make them. I
Mhm.
always feel like the reason this stuff exists is because people are just bullies,
100%.
and
I've
like,
definitely been
yeah,
in those kinds of situations, even with accommodations, but this is also where like knowing your rights is so important. And this is where like a big part of with my students is I'm always trying to inform them like, hey, like these are your rights while being here, but also here are your rights as a disabled person when you go into the workforce. You need to know these things. Um, but also like there's this big misconception, and I can understand the stress as well. Is like, oh my God, do I have to disclose? Like this is going to open me up to discrimination. Like I'm really worried about it. This is really a common thing that I see among especially music students, my students. And it is important to note that actually you can disclose without fully disclosing your disability. You can ask your psychiatrist, whomever your specialist is, and they can just say, hey, I've been seeing insert name here for this period of time. They struggle with these things due to their yada. They don't even specify your disability, just say because their disability. And they say this is the recommended accommodation, period. That's what
yeah.
I did. And
I
it was
love
very
I love
helpful.
hearing the advice. And I was gonna say along that line too, or ask you to maybe give us some more ideas as when dealing with colleagues who say things like they won't get that in the real world. I'm like, well, if you're running your own classroom, you actually will get that because you're going to provide it to yourself. But while you're doing that, a lot of times, if it is a rhythm thing, you're going to be figuring out with your students, right? Like on the board, you're going to create that visual model for the visual
Mhm.
learners. You're going to be doing things where you're actually catering to those other types of students that have those same issues. And it turns out then you're hitting all the different types of
Mhm.
learners in the room too. I kind of look at it as like a very old-fashioned mentality. I'm not sure how to drive away from that, but like even I'm in my 40s, when we were kids, we were all overstimulated and they never did anything about it, right? It was like everyone was either ADHD or they like slapped the same few things on everybody.
100%. I think that this is where some of that misconception of what neurodivergence is comes from as well, because they synonymously associate it with ADHDers and autistics, but it's actually a much bigger scope. Um, I mean, it's no different than trauma-informed learning. That is actually a neurodivergent way of learning because, people with PTSD and trauma-based neurodivergencies are neurodivergent. So we kind of are doing it in some capacities, but it's when you get down to the specificity that for some reason becomes an issue. It's very interesting. And part of it is the educational piece of them just not knowing. Sometimes it takes time, though. I will say in those conversations with other faculty or folks who might be a bit resistant, I've definitely had a conversation with one specific member of faculty I can think of, so I'm not going to name them, but that I've had to have many conversations with, and they're slowly getting there to where they're starting to be like, oh, I kind of understand what you're saying. And then they like make these small changes. And it's important to know that sometimes the changes aren't big. Sometimes it does take kind of like having many conversations, but phrasing it in a specific way of like, I understand your point, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about why you think like that. Well, maybe not specifically like that, but like I'd like to learn a little bit more about your thought process, and a lot of times that helps too.
Yeah, we have a couple good comments from Jessica in the chat box that a lot of these issues are specific to the United States because it is how things
Mhm.
are viewed and taught to us throughout our lives and, cultural differences. So it is always important to seek what your specific government's doing. And
Mhm.
then also the conversations that you have like that, they're so important and they make such a big important I think they make a big difference for students
Mhm.
and like the way that professor teaches their classes from there out, you could change a lot for so many students that you're even unaware of.
Mhm.
And those
This is
conversations are
also this
hard.
is also where that educational component comes in that's so important is like providing opportunities to learn about neurodivergence and then providing folks like that who have a really hard time understanding to have that one-to-one opportunity to actually ask questions because then you could change their mindset a little bit in that one session. And I've definitely seen plenty of those in my time of giving these types of presentations for sure.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Tara, I just wanted to thank you for coming and doing this on behalf of the DEIA committee and obviously on behalf of the ICA. This is something that's very important to our organization and obviously important to our membership. And we're really grateful for your time and expertise. And if you have any resources that you'd be willing to share with us or a resource list, we would, put that up alongside the video recording. If you're okay with that, feel free to send it my way, and I'll make sure that that goes out alongside the video recording.
Yeah, perfect. I'd be more than happy to provide that. I was also gonna say, like, anyone who is interested in me um, giving any type of chat at their university, or you'd like some training for your department of music, or you want to learn more, anything, you can email me anytime at my personal email, but you can also email me at my Berkeley email during the day hours. So my personal email is damusikfreak@gmail.com. That is my preferred method, but for some folks who just want to be like, I want to reach out to your Berkeley email, feel free. I will respond during 9 to 5 hours. It is tallen5@berkeley.edu. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much, Jess. I'm really happy I could come and give this chat for everyone. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have questions or any of the such.